Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so thrilled you're tuning in. Today, we're cracking open one of the most fascinating and frankly most important puzzles of our modern world. We're going to do a deep dive book summary of a truly groundbreaking piece of work, Why Nations Fail by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson. If you're the kind of focused learner who loves getting under the hood to understand the deep hidden forces that shape global wealth and power, well, you are in the exact right place. We're going to extract the core lessons from this book to understand the actual mechanics of prosperity.
So here's the big one. Why do some nations absolutely prosper while others just continuously struggle? It's kind of the ultimate question of global inequality, right? For decades, experts have argued that it's got everything to do with a nation's geography, or maybe the local climate, or even deeply ingrained cultural differences. Okay, let's dive right into this, because right out of the gate, the authors of our source material completely flip those assumptions upside down.
To see why those old geography and climate theories don't quite hold up, think about this stark comparison. On one hand, you have Botswana, a nation that currently boasts one of the fastest-growing economies in the entire world. But then, literally just a stone's throw away on the map, you have countries like Congo and Sierra Leone, which are tragically stuck in this relentless cycle of violence and poverty. Now, they share very similar geography, very similar climates, and even similar historical backgrounds, yet their modern realities couldn't be more different. So if it isn't the land or the weather pulling the strings, what on earth is it?
The answer hits you right between the eyes with this quote. As Daron Acemoglu brilliantly puts it, poor countries are poor because those who have power make choices that create poverty. That is the absolute primary thesis of this paradigm-shifting book. It's not the weather, it's the rules of the game. The true driver of inequality ultimately comes down to the economic and political choices made by the people sitting at the very top.
To unpack exactly how those choices play out, we're going to break this explainer down into 3 core lessons. Number 1, the institutional framework. Number 2, critical junctures. And number 3, breaking the cycle. That's our roadmap for the next few minutes.
All right, Lesson 1, the institutional framework, inclusive versus extractive institutions. Now, what's really interesting about this concept is how it sets up the fundamental rules of society. The authors argue that essentially every nation's institutions fall into one of 2 main buckets. First up, we have inclusive economic institutions. These are systems and regulations that actively encourage mass participation from everyday people. We're talking about things like strong private property laws, accessible banking, and robust public education. When a system is inclusive, it's essentially making a promise to you. It says, hey, if you work hard and if you're creative, you actually get to keep the rewards. And that is a huge deal. It motivates incredible economic growth because people know their efforts will actually bring them personal wealth. Now, contrast that directly with the extractive economic institution. These systems are designed to do exactly what the name implies. They extract. Income, wealth, and labor are quite literally taken from one massive group in society strictly to benefit a tiny, select elite group at the top. It's a system that relies entirely on exploitation. And think about it. It completely strangles any incentive for the average person to innovate or work hard. I mean, why would you build a business if the ruling class is just going to swoop in and steal it? But here's the catch. Economics don't just happen in a vacuum. They're heavily driven by politics. For an inclusive economic institution to actually survive long-term, it has to be backed by what the authors call pluralism. This is a political system where every single group in society gets a voice, and centralized power exists solely to uphold the rule of law fairly for everyone. Without pluralism, one dominant political group will inevitably take over and just rewrite the economic rules to be extractive again. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what these definitions look like when they collide with the real world. Under inclusive systems, you see nations like South Korea and the USA thriving, largely because of their economic freedoms and pluralistic structures. On the flip side, looking at extractive systems, we have historical examples like colonial Latin America, which was built entirely on the exploitation of indigenous populations. Or look at modern-day North Korea. A single-family regime hoards all the power, completely outlaws private property, and leaves the masses in staggering poverty. The difference in living standards here isn't just big, it is absolutely massive. Let's move on to Lesson 2, critical junctures, specifically the Black Death catalyst. So, you might be wondering, how do these deeply entrenched extractive institutions ever actually change? Well, history shows us it usually takes a massive, earth-shattering, actually scratch that, a truly paradigm-shifting event. The authors call this a critical juncture.
This is an event so influential that it completely overturns the socio-political balance of a nation or even an entire continent. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at the ultimate historical example from the mid-14th century, the Black Death. This plague wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. It was an unimaginable human tragedy, but from a purely economic standpoint, it was the ultimate disruptor. Let's trace how this disruption actually played out. Before the 14th century, Europe was locked into this deeply extractive feudalism. Monarchs and lords owned all the land, while the peasants did all the grueling labor for basically zero rights and incredibly high taxes. But then the plague hits. Suddenly there's a massive, unprecedented shortage of labor. Because so many people had died, the peasants who survived were suddenly in incredibly high demand. Moving into the post-14th century, this extreme scarcity of labor meant the old socio-political balance was totally broken. The lords needed the peasants more than the peasants needed the lords.
But here is where the historical narrative gets really fascinating. Take a look at the radically divergent outcomes from the exact same plague. In Western Europe, the peasants were relatively organized. They realized they had leverage, and they used it to demand lower taxes and more rights, effectively spelling the end of extractive feudalism in the West. However, over in Eastern Europe, the peasants just weren't as organized. The powerful landowners managed to take advantage of the chaos, hiking taxes even higher and making the system even more brutally extractive. Same exact catalyst, entirely different paths.
And that leads us directly to this concept, institutional drift. This is what happens when two previously similar regions experience a critical juncture, take divergent paths, and then, over centuries, grow in vastly different economic directions. A tiny handful of critical junctures, things like the Black Death or the expansion of global colonization, can set countries on radically different trajectories. It's like a giant puzzle that perfectly explains how the global map of wealth and poverty was drawn over hundreds of years.
All right, let's move to lesson 3 and see how this builds into breaking the cycle, and more importantly, how nations actually improve today.
We've seen how history dramatically shapes nations, but are poor countries just doomed forever by their past? Absolutely not. But to fix things, I want to challenge a super common assumption, one that the authors address head-on. Foreign aid, as well-intentioned as it is, does very little to actually change extractive institutions in places like Africa and Central Asia. Remember, history doesn't doom a country, but simply throwing money at an extractive, corrupt regime doesn't fix the root problem, right? Without changing the underlying rules of the game, that money often just ends up enriching the very elites who are doing the oppressing.
So, if simply writing a check isn't the silver bullet, what is the actual roadmap for long-lasting change? Well, the source material lays out these distinct steps. Step 1, empower grassroots movements. Step 2, have those movements boldly defy the oppressing institutions. And Step 3, pave the way for inclusive coalitions. The authors point to the U.S. civil rights movement as a prime example of this. Marginalized groups fought from the ground up to dismantle extractive, exclusive systems and quite literally force the nation to become more politically and economically inclusive. It started with the people.
Let's walk through another fantastic case study from the text that proves this step-by-step process actually works. Brazil. Back in 1985, a grassroots movement of empowered, everyday people, not elites, not politicians, but citizens, overthrew the country's military dictatorship. They led powerful social movements that effectively paved the way for a coalition designed specifically to block any future dictatorships from taking hold. And the result? Once they broke that extractive cycle and built inclusive institutions, Brazil saw a massive rise in prosperity. They became one of the world's fastest-growing economies between 2000 and 2012. It is proof positive that it is literally never too late for a nation to shatter the chains of poverty.
So the crucial point is this. The fate of a nation isn't written in the stars. It's not in the soil, and it's certainly not in the climate. It's written in the rules we choose to live by and the institutions we actively build. So I'll leave you with this. What extractive or inclusive institutions are shaping your nation's future today? Are you seeing a push toward pluralism and shared wealth? Or are you seeing power and resources getting concentrated at the very top? Keep your eyes open and question the systems around you, because the mechanics of prosperity and poverty are playing out all around us every single day. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.